Here's just a couple of quotes. We're headed for disaster in America. The bottom quote says the world's going to hell economically. We all see what's happening in Europe. We all see what's going on in our country. It'll affect national security. Next. Terminology, you've got it. Our deficit, what happens each year, our debt, the accumulation of the deficits, and our GDP, what we grow. Okay, next. Here's some quick facts. We were at 14.3 on August 2nd, $14.3 trillion. You know what $1 trillion is? You know how long it takes to get to 1,000,000 seconds? 12 days. You know how long it takes to get to 1,000,000,000 seconds? 32 years. You know how long it takes to get to 1,000,000,000,000 seconds? 32,000 years. That's a little perspective on what 1 trillion is. Right now we're 14.7 roughly in debt because on August 2nd our debt went up $400 billion. In a week it'll go up $500 billion more on September 30th. Okay? So we'll be at 15.2 on the 30th of September. We're going to be at 16.4 in 15 months. $16.4 trillion in debt in 15 months. Our GDP is 15 trillion. What does that say? We're growing at 1%. We're going to be at more debt than we have GDP in America. And that's a combination of public debt and private debt. Our budget's 3.6 trillion. Our revenues are 2.3 trillion. Our deficit's 1.3 trillion this year. We've had a couple of straight years of $1 trillion debts. For the rest of the decade, we'll be between 800 billion and $1 trillion in debt every year for the next decade. We borrow about 40 cents out of everything we spend. Next slide. Here's the 4.6 that we owe ourselves. It's intergovernmental debt. Most of it's Social Security debt. I will say this last year we were $50 billion in the red on Social Security, not counting interest in that account. But that's 4.6 trillion. But the external debt, 10.1 trillion, of which foreigners hold about 40 to 50%, of which China holds $1.3 trillion more or less. Next slide, please. Bottom quote, federal foreign government through the actions of its central bank put great pressure on the U.S. in a way the military never could. Of course, that can apply to its central bank, its government leaders, whatever. Next slide, please. Just gives you a quick idea of how our debt has grown and where it may go if something doesn't happen. Next slide, please. Okay, right now our public debt is about 68% of the GDP. Our public debt is projected to go to 81% of GDP by 2021, with many of the projections for cuts that are out there now, if they come about. With the Bush tax cuts, it'll go down to 76%. But the key figure is our overall debt. We got to pay the overall debt. And when Social Security goes into the red, other monies have to come into place. Bonds have to be issued, taxes have to be raised, so that we're at 100% of our debt with GDP now. Next slide. Mandatory part of our budget, 62% and growing. Give you some idea of the big buckets of our debt. Medicare, Medicaid, 21%. Social Security, 20%. DOD, really that should read defense, 20%. Next slide, please. Where does our money come from? All kinds of wild ideas, but here it is. About $900 billion from your income tax, about just under $300 billion from corporations. Social Security and payroll tax is a huge chunk, almost $900 billion. Other taxes, excise taxes, state taxes, inheritance taxes, gift taxes, chump change. Next slide. This is where your money goes. But look at a couple of those figures. The overall figure for national security is $850 billion, but the baseline, and baseline, people can differ on this by $15 billion. But let's say it was $530 billion for DOD this year. They're saying that next year it's going to be $515 billion. They're saying that's the same as FY11. So let's just fudge it a little bit and say it's about $525. But look where the baseline is relative to Social Security. $200 billion less. It's less than Medicare. It's just a couple $100 billion more than Medicaid, the federal portion of Medicaid, not to include the state portion. That's where your money goes. Next slide. Last two entries, basically we're paying about the same for our DOD baseline as we're paying on interest on the debt this year and next year, and it'll only grow on the interest side. Next. Somebody mentioned the 3.5% percentage of defense spending as part of the GDP. It's 3.5% and plunging. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is the big problem, our unfunded liabilities. This is just what we were doing year to year that I've talked about so far. Now we get into the big numbers. What have we promised that we haven't provided money for? The unfunded liabilities. People give you wildly different numbers on this could be. But I think a fair number is 70 trillion. But you will have other good people say it ranges up to $125 trillion. But if it's 70 trillion, about 55 trillion would come out of Medicare and Medicaid. Promises we've made we haven't paid for, or provided to be paid for, and about 15 trillion in Social Security. Next slide, please. Lots of proposals out there. Simpson, Bowles, Domenici, Rivlin, these are all bipartisan groups. The President's budget, the Ryan budget, the Obama April proposal, the House bill, it should read 2 August, I'm sorry, the Senate bill, the Budget Control Act, and most recently, 2-3 days ago, President Obama's September proposal. So the point is that when the super committee meets, it doesn't have to go over and break a lot of new ground. There have been think tank after proposal after proposal for years, including about 5 in the past 12 months, that have laid out every option conceivable. It's called cut and paste. Cut and paste, but they've got to get to a lot of money. Next slide. Okay, lots of folks are confused about how this all works. When a thing passed on 2 August, the debt went up $400 trillion, just like that. It goes up $500 trillion on the 30th. I mentioned that. To accompany that, there were a little over $900 billion in cuts according to the CBO. The President claims it was about $1 trillion too. But let's go with the lower number. Debt increase in the ceiling was offset by spending cuts. That's where we get to our first big chop at DOD. What has to happen next is there's a super committee that's come into being. It has to make its recommendations by the 23rd of November. Different committees make their recommendations to it by 23 October. Congress has to pass it by 23 December. The President has to sign it by 15 January. Or the trigger goes into effect, and that's what we've all talked about, which is the end of the world if that happens. Next slide, please. Okay, here are the members of the committee. You've seen their names many times, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. Next slide, please. More or less, in phase 1, what was passed on August 2nd, which is already done, more or less, security spending, broadly defined, will be cut about $5 billion. I think Tom was accurate when he said that it's very hard to figure out what this bill does. It's not plain English. But $5 billion is a reasonable suggestion, and that might mean a slight cut ultimately in DOD, although I saw the Senate Appropriations Committee passed about a $515 billion bill a couple days ago. The House is at about $530 billion now. But more or less, DOD is flatlined for next year. And the bottom line on this is $350 billion from the budget category of defense, $330 billion directly from DOD. Next slide. Okay, the super committee and the trigger. The super committee has to come up with $1.2 trillion in cuts. Who knows what they'll do? We just talked about that. The trigger kicks in. Now, it's not $1.2 trillion that has to be cut. $200 billion is taken care of with interest. So that leaves about $500 billion left for defense and $500 billion left for other. Okay? Next slide, please. If you total all these things up, if the super committee does what people think it will do, and there's all kinds of opinions about that, I suggest they'll cut $350 to $500 billion. Add that to the $330 billion that's already been cut from DOD, and you get about $700 or $800 billion. Okay? If they don't act, or the President doesn't sign it, and a balanced budget amendment is not passed by 30 December, that's the other option, then half of the trigger kicks in, or about $500 billion. You add the $500 billion that the trigger kicks in to the $330 billion, and now you've got a baseline cut of about $800 billion to DOD. And if you use what the President was projecting he needed over the next decade, it's closer to $1 trillion in cut from that baseline. Okay, next slide. Here's just a quick synopsis of it. You're going to have $2 trillion to $4 trillion over 10 years. $900 billion came from phase 1, $1.2 trillion from the super committee or the trigger cuts. Broad range. If everything goes well, $400 billion in cuts at the minimum, $950 kind of at the top end. Next slide. Oh, and the last line on there I didn't read was that DOD budget under the trigger will drop below $500 billion in FY13 if it kicks in. What will happen? There'll be procurement cuts, equipment cuts, personnel cuts, healthcare fees will kick in, readiness training will decline, There'll be greatly enhanced risk as a result of our military capability decreasing. Next slide. But lots of things could happen. The super committee could make smaller cuts than they're supposed to do. They could make larger cuts than they're supposed to do. Most groups are urging them to go big and make larger cuts. Congress could amend the law. Congress could ignore the laws that are under previous budget control acts. They could waive enforcement of the Budget Control Act if we're having a national crisis, in theory. So lots of options up there. Next slide, please. Okay, President Obama just submitted his $4 trillion proposal, but he indicated he'd veto any congressional proposal. In other words, what Congress is supposed to do over the next 90 days, unless it included revenue increases in addition to spending cuts. Speaker Boehner has said the grand bargain is off the table. Again, there's pressure on the super committee to go big, meaning more than 1.2 trillion cut. Everybody of those committees I mentioned earlier called for $4 trillion or more. Go long, think in terms of those entitlement programs are the big drivers of the debt. They're huge, and go smart. Think about growth. What can we make for changes that will grow the economy? If we grow the economy, we grow ourselves out of it. Next slide, please. And I'll go to the next one. And here's just one way to look at the debt from your and my perspective as little common people. If we were to look at this, and I take this from something Joseph Curl did in the Washington Times a couple days ago, our income would be $22,000 this year. We'd have expenses of $37,000. So we're in the hole pretty good at this point. But we've done this for 10 years in a row. That puts us $150,000 in debt as an individual. Okay? If we're going to try to pay that off over 20 years, by the way, that's not the goal of the Budget Control Act. But if that was our goal, we would have to cut our expenses by 2/3 to make that goal. Thank you very much.